We've spent an awful lot of time on this video talking about DWI, being impaired, and I think a lot of the folks who are watching this equate that with drinking too much alcohol. But what about if the impairment refers to some kind of drug use? Tell me about that.
Well, drug impairment is very difficult to deal with because you can't measure it. North Carolina doesn't recognize a set number of kilograms per gram or whatever in your blood, where they do with alcohol. If you got a .08 of alcohol, you're impaired, whether you look impaired or not. There's no such standard for marijuana usage or Ritalin usage or any one of a number of prescription drugs that potentially could impair you, but you may or may not be impaired. So a blood test that's going to show some amount of cocaine was in your system that could have been in there for a week and you're not at all impaired on it, it may come back with trace amounts of different types of drugs in it. Well, then the state has a drug test that they can put in, or a blood test that they can put in with some drugs, but what does it mean? And it's hard to find a doctor that's going to say, well, based on this number, you were or you weren't impaired. So neither the state nor the defense are going to likely find a doctor that can look at a number on a piece of paper and say whether or not somebody's impaired for drugs. So instead, recently, the North Carolina has set up this program called a drug recognition expert, and they send officers off to a 20 or 40-hour class and teach them things like horizontal gaze nystagmus. They wave a pen in front of your eyes.
Isn't that kind of subjective?
It's completely subjective, and it's the practice of medicine. I mean, horizontal gaze nystagmus, an ophthalmologist will tell you that there's 100 different causes for it, and you shouldn't have law enforcement out there practicing medicine. So what North Carolina is trying to do, though, is prove these drug cases with what I call junk testimony or junk evidence. So now to get that past the court, the legislature has rewritten the law to try and qualify a law enforcement officer who's been to a few classroom episodes as an expert. Well, they're not necessarily, but the legislature is trying to tell the courts that they've got to accept them as experts. So your DWI lawyer has got to really be up on Rule 704 on what is and isn't an expert and whether or not they qualify under these new drug recognition expert statutes.
Well, we've talked about so many different types of tests, test results. I think in the next segment we might backtrack a little bit and talk once again about what happens if you refuse to take any of these tests.